Professor Sjef van Erp is a professor of civil law and property law at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He is vice president of the prestigious European Law Institute, and he was recently appointed Secretary General of the International Legal Science Association, and of course is particularly a leading scholar worldwide known for his studies in property law particularly. And today he accepted to answer to some questions, particularly on the teaching in different countries and different languages, thanks to his experience of teaching abroad. And the answers will be asked by Antonio Diano, who is a first-year student of the Comparative European International Legal Studies program, this new bachelor program offered in English by Trento University. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and thank you to Antonio as well for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor Ioriatti, and I am very pleased to have you here at the University of Trento.
Thank you.
And I would like to firstly ask you about the method of teaching, because I know that there are some differences from in the different European countries, for example, between Netherlands and Italy, about the way of teaching and about the way of approaching to the students. I know that in Maastricht University there is a method which is called problem-based learning. And if you could please just tell us a little bit more about this, and in your opinion, if this kind of method could be successful in Italy as well, considering also the background of the Italian legal framework.
Thank you. This is a very interesting question about, I think, which we could talk quite longer than the time that we have for this interview. When Maastricht University was founded, it is a young university, very much like Trento is. The idea was that the style of teaching should be different, that it should not be a professor standing in front of a large group of students with whom he had no contact, but that we should teach in small groups, 10, 12 students maximum, and that the professor, the lecturer, would basically only supervise the process of learning of those students. So basically the students would learn themselves, and the only thing the lecturer would do is at the end see whether the process went well or not. But one student would be, let's say, the leader for the discussions, the conversation on the particular topic. Students would do their own research, they would check one another. Basically, you would teach yourself. Now that the university, the faculty has grown, it is more difficult to maintain that system in the sense that we now have groups of 15, sometimes 19 students. But still, I think 19 is the absolute maximum for a system like this. The consequence is also that in my faculty, the relationship between students and professors is far more informal than here in Italy, because you sit together in these small groups and you get to know one another. So the system of teaching, which I still see here in Italy as the lezione frontale, I think that is not a style of teaching that we, generally speaking, follow as the only method of teaching. You still teach large groups of students. So I still teach to a group of 300 students, but we still split them up, always split them up in smaller groups and work together with them in these smaller groups.
Okay, so I have another kind of question always about this, because I'm very interested in the relationship between the student and the professor. And why do you think it is important to have this kind of informal relationship, and what are the main benefits for a student? Because, as you said before, in Italy it is still quite different.
I think it is important that in an international environment, the relationship between professors and students is a bit more informal and therefore more direct. The group of students is quite diverse, so the students have to become one group. So they have to overcome cultural differences, linguistic problems. The language we use and you now use is English, but for most of us that is not our first language. So we all struggle a little bit when we talk English because it is not our mother tongue. In such an environment, you need a professor, a lecturer, who creates an open atmosphere in which you have the courage to speak out and make mistakes. Because only from making mistakes you learn. And that is not only the law, so what you teach as a professor, but also the fact that you stand up speak, discuss. Feel free to say what you think and do not worry too much about is this grammatically correct or not. And I think in an open atmosphere, that process goes much faster and far more efficient than if the professor just sits behind the desk, has a microphone in front of him, and reads out the lecture notes. So I think particularly in an international environment, a more informal approach is very fruitful.
It is time for me for a curiosity, because I know that you have a very broad international experience, and so you teach also in a language which is not yours, of course, and you have taught also in German, in French. So my question is, why is it so challenging but also difficult to teach in a language which is not yours? And what are the main successful examples of this kind of way of teaching?
It is difficult, definitely. First of all, when you teach in a language which is not yours, you need to have a vocabulary that is big enough that if you get a question, you do not answer that question simply by repeating literally what you said before. You must be able to use different words, alternative phrases, and so on, because otherwise it doesn't work. Because a student asks you a question because what you said earlier was not understood, and then it's no point, not good, if you simply literally reply what you said earlier. So it means that your vocabulary must be good, your grammar must be good, but also your knowledge of legal terminology. And that is a major problem, particularly for young lecturers in the beginning, particularly when you teach an area in which you did not do any research. So basically when you prepare your lectures in a foreign language, you're struggling with language, legal language, and content. And sometimes really in that order, not so much content first and then language, but language first and then content. And that makes teaching in a foreign language quite challenging, but also very interesting. Because legal terminology and content, of course, are closely related. So by learning to explain things in a foreign language, basically you do you do academic research by speaking a foreign language. What I find challenging about it is that you can talk to students in their own language. So when I teach in Germany and speak German, I can talk to them directly in their own language. In France or Quebec, the same. And this is why I'm now learning Italian, so that at least I can make myself understood also in your language. Because I think it is important as a visiting professor also, if possible, and particularly when you are in a country for a longer period, that you speak the language of that country also.
Thank you, Professor Van Erpe. My last question is a little bit more personal. Why do you think that a student has to study law in Trento here?
Well, I think what is challenging about Trento, very much like Maastricht, is that this is a young law faculty. So it's based on newer ideas on how to teach law. It's based on a focus on comparative law, studying European Union law. Your location, like in the case of Maastricht, is very well suited for that because you are close to a language borderline, Italian and German. You're close to Austria. So I would say this is, when you want to study comparative law and foreign law, this is a perfect environment. I'm not saying that it is the only perfect environment, but it is a perfect environment, like Maastricht. Because what we did in Maastricht was that next to this teaching in small groups, we very quickly realized that our location, like here in Trento, was really good for setting up an international program. We're close to Belgium, close to Germany, close to Luxembourg. So why not use that? Why say, well, if this is the area in which we physically are located, why not use that? And so this is why Maastricht became, let's say, a faculty that both has quite an interesting approach to how to teach and has this international flavor. And I see the same in Trento.